lovely to see so many people here today. It's just lovely indeed. I was talking, Keith, one of your former students, just a little while ago, an hour and a half ago, and they were remembering you very fondly, and I can see them here. I won't say who it was. They might come through with a question a bit later, I imagine. So, selamat siang, sore, malam, whatever time it is for you, and welcome to our Monash seminar today. This is the third that we've run in the last few months. I want to start by acknowledging and paying respect to the traditional custodians of the Kulin lands upon which many of us are placed today. And I would also like to acknowledge and pay respect to the elders of the land, both past and present, and acknowledge that claims to sovereignty were never ceded. My name is Sharon Graham-Davies, and I'm the director of the Whykeith Indonesian Engagement Centre here at Monash. I'd like to take this opportunity to welcome all of our guests, all the very many of you from across the world, especially those of you in Indonesia. A few housekeeping points. We're recording, which you'll see when you have to click that, and the recording will be made available shortly on our Whykeith website. Second, we encourage you to write questions into the chat box, and we'll come back to these at the end of the talk. So please, as we go, put your questions in there. And also sign up for our newsletter, follow us on Twitter, and also our Whykeith Facebook page, so you can keep up to date on all of our activities. Now, before introducing our speakers, I'm going to turn over to Reni, who will tell us about all the fantastic Indonesian library resources that we have here at Monash, and tell us about the plan for the session. Thanks, Reni.
Thank you, Sharon. Welcome back, everyone. This is the third session of Monash Indonesian Seminar Series for 2020. The Monash Indonesian Seminar Series is a collaboration between Monash Whykeith Indonesian Engagement Center and Monash University Library. My name is Reni Pulungan, and I'm the subject librarian for Indonesian Studies. Huge thank you for all the participants who are joining us through Zoom today. We've got a good turn up for today, which is good. Today's talk is about social commitment in literature and the arts, conflicting narrative of Indonesia's leftist culture, which is going to be presented by Dr. Keith Foucher, and we've got discussant Professor Julian Nili and special guest from Bandung, Mas Kelana Wisnu Saptanugraha. Now, but before I'm handing it over back to Sharon, I would like to show you, as usual, the Monash University Library resources on the seminar topic. Let me share you my screen. So, for example, if you are wanting to look for the book that we are going to discuss today, I can search the author's name, so Keith Foucher here, and I can see his book is listed on my search results. So this is through Monash Library Catalog. So I'm clicking on the title of the book. And here is the record of the book. And if you are interested to actually look for other books, so as you can see here, this particular book is published by Monash University Center of Southeast Asian Studies. You can actually click on the link to the author link to look for more books or working papers in the same series. So obviously, for this particular book that we are going to talk about today, it's currently out on loan. So someone is reading this book. But as I said before, you can click the link to Monash University Center of Southeast Asian Studies to look for more publications published by the center. So that's how you find more books. When I was doing research about the center, because this was before my time at Monash, the Center of Southeast Asian Studies was one of Monash's major contribution to the study of Asia, and it was established, I think it was in 1964. And by 1967, I found it from just doing a bit of research about the center. The center had 9 postgraduate students under its umbrella, and by 1981, the number had grown to over 50. And the center provides guidance, context, stimulating seminar program, and limited travel grants for field work. Now, talking about stimulating seminars, Monash Indonesian Seminar Series is one of the seminars which we hope to stimulate researchers, academics, and students working on Indonesia. And we hope to continue this seminar for years to come. I'm going to hand it back over to Sharon to introduce our speakers today. Thank you.
Thank you, Reni. So today we're joined by Dr. Keith Fulcher, who many of you will know in various capacities, including many of his former language students who remember their days in his class with great fondness. But to introduce Keith and Kelana and to run the seminar until the questions, I'm going to hand over to my dear colleague, Professor of Indonesian Studies here at Monash, Julian Millie. You're muted.
Thank you so much, Sharon, and thanks also, Reni, for that introduction and for enabling this to happen. And thank you also to our two special guests, Kelana, who's from Pustaka Pias and is joining us from Bandung. Welcome, and also congratulations on the new publication. And also welcome to Keith Fulcher, a former Monash academic who is, I guess it's fair to say, in the middle of quite a high-achieving career here at the moment. And the reason why this is all happening, of course, is because Kelana at Pustaka Pias has edited a translation of one of Keith's works. So, Reni, perhaps you could just put up some slides just to give you a bit of a summary, an orientation of Keith's work. We've got some slides here that show some of the legacy. So if we go back, can you keep this one here? So this is the Monash publication that has just been published in translation by Pustaka Pias in Indonesian, and that's what brought on this event today. And this is, of course, Keith's work. By no means his first work. He'd already done work on modern Indonesian literature before that time. And since that time, he's continued to be active, and we just thought we'd show some of the more recent works from Keith's pen and collaborative works that he's done. So, Reni, if you could just move through through some of these images here. This is a groundbreaking work, Clearing a Space, Post-Colonial Studies of Indonesian Literature, which is published in Indonesian. And, yep, can we keep going there? And one more. And this is, I think, Keith's most recent work. It's an edited volume about the visit of Richard Wright and the coverage of Richard Wright of the Bandung Conference in 1955, which Keith produced with Brian Russell Roberts. And I thoroughly recommend this volume for quite an amazing perspective on post-colonial intellectual activity, and specifically also the intellectual worlds of Indonesia. Could you please keep moving then, Reni? And here we arrive at the new translation that we're just going to be talking about today. So what I thought we would do is I'll start by giving a bit of information about the 1986 publication, and then we'll speak to Keith about the background and get some idea of what it was like working on this project, and then we'll move to Kelana for some comments about why produce this translation in the present. So that's the broad outline. So the book that we're talking about here, which is of course Social Commitment in Literature of the Arts, is really a kind of historical analysis of a cultural movement in Indonesian history, which commenced around 1950, and with the establishment of the Lembaga Kebudayaan Rakyat, Lekra. And that continued then till about 1965, and events that unfolded in Indonesian society and politics after 1965 meant the end of Lekra. So there's a 15-year time span that's covered by the book. And Lekra wasn't only literature. It also included film, the plastic arts, and visual arts as well. So it was a kind of gathering or umbrella body for creative people in this space. And very early on, it became known as a group of cultural producers on the left side of the Indonesian political spectrum. And in fact, the association with the PKI, the Indonesian Communist Party, this is something in the book that Keith's keen to make the important point that in fact it's by no means the case that Lekra was the cultural wing of the Communist Party, but nevertheless there were communists sitting on the board of Lekra from the very beginning. But the tradition of writing, it's not, you couldn't look at the Lekra literary corpus and hope to find material about the sort of the struggle in its more formalistic communist terms. So, for example, Keith makes a point, there's not much there about the class struggle or the means of production. But what you do find is that this writing fits well into pre-existing Indonesian traditions of nationalist, anti-imperialist writing. And that's a point that Keith makes quite often through the book. And the movement came to have very tense relations with other currents of Indonesian literature in Indonesian society throughout that 15-year period. And I think that's one of the nice things of the book is you get an idea of the struggle that was going on over terms like Kesusastraan Indonesia and who really had the claims to talk about Sastra Indonesia from an authoritative perspective. And it's in those kind of disputes that the real tensions emerge in Indonesian society at the time. So, for example, the Lekra cultural producers had a lot in common, in particular the anti-imperialism, a wariness towards foreign cultures, particularly the American culture that was arriving in Indonesia at the time, a commitment to budaya rakyat in the sense that the true cultural producers were the ordinary people with all their struggles. And there is also a resistance to a commitment to an international humanism that shared with other Indonesian writers, but that also became a point of difference in several key ways. A point Keith makes about the legacy of Lekra and about the political events of 1965 was that the people growing up after 1965 confronted a very strong polarisation in Indonesian cultural life, where ideology became radically separated from literature in the sense of writing as a form of artifice for expression. And the ideology side of it was basically purged from that spectrum in those years after 1965. So that's a very brief summary of the book. I really recommend that you have a look at. And once again, congratulations to Kalana for publishing it for the first time in the Indonesian language. So Keith, I'm wondering if I can draw you into the conversation here and ask you perhaps about how the monograph came to be written. Was it sort of, you had a lot of friendships at the time that pointed you in that direction? There'd also been some publications of works by Pramuja, for example, in the early 1980s. What was it then that sort of brought you into that field?
Yeah, you'll have to stop me talking too much about this. This is a long story. It actually, to tell the full story, would go back to my first visit to Indonesia as an undergraduate student at the beginning of 1968, going back a long way. But the short version really starts with a visit that I made to Indonesia in 1981. And crucially, my friends David Hill and Krishna Sen, who were at that time a part of the Monash Centre of Southeast Asian Studies postgraduate student community. They were living in Jakarta at that time, researching their PhDs. And on this visit that I made in 1981, they took me to visit some of their friends and contacts among former Lekra members who had been released from lengthy periods of political imprisonment towards the end of the 1970s. Now, it was only a fleeting contact and it was confined to just chats with some of these people about their former lives. But it was really exciting and it opened up a whole new world to me. And as you're suggesting, all that you heard about Lekra in those days, I mean, we were all questioning it. But all that you heard about LECRA was that it was a front organisation of the Indonesian Communist Party that was purpose was to promote communist propaganda in literature and the arts. And it was this brief contact with these friends of David and Krishna that gave me a window into a whole other story of how we might look at this. So I came back from that trip really anxious to know more, and I started to look for library resources about LECRA and its history. There wasn't much. And what there was largely in that, that deadly old format of microfilm and microfiche holdings from American libraries. Most of it was from Cornell University Library, PKI newspapers and magazines, documents from LECRA congresses, small amount of creative literature. So I just set about, reading what I could of this material. It wasn't a funded research project or anything like that. It was just something that I did in non-teaching time, in university vacations. Indonesian libraries, of course, were closed to this sort of research at this time, but I did keep up my contact with a few former LECRA people in Indonesia. I never did anything as structured as formal interviews, but it was great, so sort of through the social contacts, just listening to people talk and asking the odd question. I started to form my own approach to their stories. And like you've said, when I finally felt my way towards what it was that I wanted to do, I had the sense that I wanted to write about the history of LECRA from the point of view of its own documentary record and practices. But I knew that I wanted to place LECRA in that bigger history of what Claire Holt, in that great book that she wrote in the 1960s called Art in Indonesia, she coined the term the Great Debate. And that was her way of referring to this debate that Indonesian intellectuals and creative artists had been engaged in since the 1930s about what was modern Indonesian culture, where did it come from and where was it going? And I got the sense early on that the story of LECRA belonged in that context. I was also much influence at that time by some work that Robert Cribb was doing on Indonesian Marxism, because it fitted with the sense that I was getting that Marxism in Indonesia, that Indonesian Marxism was a part of Indonesian cultural history, that it had a long history, and it wasn't just a direct import from the Soviet Union or China. It was something that represented a part of Indonesian cultural history. Also, I got the sense early on that I wanted to do something that would give me the chance to put together a little anthology of examples of LECRA poetry and short stories, because it was very hard to get that sort of thing in those days. All that you saw was the odd propaganda poem, And through the things I was reading, I was coming into contact with things that were very hard to get a hold of, and I thought, this needs to be known better. So that's how it evolved. It was very piecemeal. It wasn't a research project the way things are done these days. Carefully worked out and critiqued and funded and all that sort of thing. It was very haphazard. And I knew what I was doing had a lot of shortcomings. Of course, you can't not be aware of what you're not doing, But I knew also that it was new at the time, both in content and approach. And
could I just ask you on that point, Keith? One of the points that you make about the period so you divide into two periods.
Yeah.
50 to 59 and then 59 to 65. And what was clear was that 59 to 65 was the time when the really quite vicious sort of polarization quite emerged. And you talk about Habe Yassin and Hamka as people who were very much targeted by LECRA, by the LECRA sort of, the LECRA organisation and its publications. Did you find when you were doing this, when you were talking with the people and so on in the early 80s, were those kind of enmities still to be encountered? Could you feel that? Did you have to be careful about what you did, or were they sort of in a way forgotten, considering all the suffering that some of those people that you dealt with had to endure?
That's a very good question, and it really does depend on the individuals concerned. You know, we know that everyone knows. You know that someone like Pramudia was fiery right to the end. You know, Pramudia never forgot or forgave what he saw as betrayals, both of himself personally and of the ideals of, he would say, the ideals of Indonesian nationalism. Others had suffered so much, they just wanted to put all that sort of stuff behind them. And others recognised that it was extremely damaging at the time, you know, that they, as LECRA and members of LECRA and the organisation, had been drawn into very damaging ad hominem sort of attacks, you know, when what they really wanted to talk about was these bigger questions about Indonesian culture, but it got all caught up in nasty, really nasty attacks on individuals, and then that generated the revenge attacks, of course, you know.
Yeah. So then when it was released, the reviews, I think, are actually quite interesting that came out of the book. I had a look at some of them in preparation for today, because, of course, the book was coming into a Western academic world that was also ideologically divided about these kind of questions. So can you tell us about the reviews? Because, I mean, you had some fantastic reviews from Benedict Anderson and so on. How did you find that, the process of having the reviews?
I think it's a good question, because the reviews, stop me again if I talk too much, but the reviews do tell an interesting story, you know, in themselves. I was, you know, I think looking back on it, quite genuinely surprised that this little book attracted so much attention, and indeed so much positive attention. But I was also very chastened by the sort of criticism that it attracted. And I think I learnt a lot by working through in my own mind the sorts of criticism that was made of it. I'll talk about just a few examples of that. And I should say that it's really very nice to see in the introduction to the Indonesian translation, the Pustaka Piasa's publication, they've included a contemporary review of the original book by Ariel Herianto, because that's another nice Monash connection. For people who don't know, Ariel Herianto is Sharon's predecessor in her current position. But Ariel at the time was a lecturer at UKSW in Salatiga, and he wrote what was probably the most comprehensive an important review of the original publication in Indonesian. And it's an interesting review. It's there, as I say, in the new publication. It's an interesting review because it kind of illustrates what could and couldn't be said about this topic in Indonesia at the time. Right. It's quite a detailed review of the content of the book. But Ariel is careful not to engage too much with the arguments, you know, to put himself into it. And it's quite subtle too, because he finds a way of both distancing himself from it and endorsing it at the same time by saying it's very important for us to have a detailed critical analysis of LECRA by an outsider. And that's kind of an answer to the critic who says, you know, what can an outsider know about this? Ariel is kind of drawing in to say that we need someone outside this hothouse Indonesian context to kind of look at this a little bit more coolly. And that was really very, very nice for me to see at the time. You mentioned Ben Anderson's review. This was fantastic, because this was just a few years after Ben Anderson's Imagined Communities made him an international figure in studies of nationalism. And the fact that he wrote such an enthusiastic and complimentary review was wonderful because you know, he was a bit of a hero to a lot of us of my generation in Indonesian studies at that time. But kind of, you know, moving to the critical reviews, there's one that kind of sticks with me until now, and that was a review by an American scholar called Donald Hindley. He had written a book about the Indonesian Communist Party that was published in 1964. That's very significant because 1964, it's the height of the PKI's influence, and it's also the height of the Cold War, of course. And the book was written from an American Cold War perspective. And he used, it was that same context in which he wrote a review of my work, you know, more than 20 years later. And I don't have it anymore, and I don't even remember where it was published, so I can't go checking it. But the thing that I remember sticking with me from that was a point that he took up that related to an argument that I'd presented based on LECRA materials, based on the 1959 LECRA manifesto, which kind of said things like, LECRA welcomes all artistic styles. You know, we are not dogmatic in matters of aesthetics. We welcome all artists and all artistic styles. And it's kind of like a theme that you referred to, that I stressed all through my study, that what LECRA saw was as important was the question of attitude or spirit, you know, that not the form in which a work of art appeared, but the identification of the writer or artist with the ordinary Indonesian people. You know, I called it the kerakyatan awareness, you know, in my study. And so that I was stressing that if we read LECRA's own story, it kind of didn't aim to enforce rigid and prescriptive norms you know. Now Hindley picked up on that and implied that it was very naive to take that at face value, because the only reason LECRA didn't enforce these rigid and prescriptive norms was that it didn't yet have the power to do so. And he said, look, we've got examples from other communist regimes of what happens when communist parties come to power and are in the position to enforce their cultural ideology. We've got the example from elsewhere in the world of what would have happened in Indonesia. And I spent a lot of time thinking about that, and in the end was troubled by this conditional tense, you know, the focus on what would have or might have happened in Indonesia. And I knew that you know, if the power struggle had been different. We have, you know, I knew that we all know the examples of repression and much worse from Stalin's Soviet Union and Mao's China. But it seemed to me that what we had in Indonesia was the reverse, that you know, we had the repression of LECRA and the victimization of its followers. And it seemed to me that as outsiders, it behoved us to record that history rather than getting caught up in questions of what might have happened or would have happened. I think, you know, that might be something that people would still debate, but it did have an important influence on my thinking, you know?
So speaking about influence, Keith, so you'd already come off quite a significant study of pre-independence novels in Malay and also the Pujangga Baru. And so you had a really privileged perception on this claim that could be made by various currents about the real Indonesian literature. If we move into the present now and talk about the canon of Indonesian literature, do you think there'll be anything from the LECRA umbrella that will be considered by contemporary or future Indonesians to be canonical in any way?
Yeah, that's a really tricky one. Just before I do it, can I just say something else? Just on it's kind of a bridge between that and the reviews, because I wanted to say something about another Monash connection, and that was a working paper by Gunawan Muhammad that was published in 1988, 2 years after my LECRA monograph. It's not a review, but I think in many ways it's a reply to it. And I just want to say that it was one of the things that was important to me, because it I don't want to go into details, but it was about, it was a participant's observation of that period of ideological struggle in the arts in the years before 1965. And it was important to me because it taught me that just as I had argued that LECRA was not monolithic, that there were lots of different currents within it, different ideas and aspirations, and there were also conflicts between LECRA and the PKI. The same was true of LECRA's opponents, that they were a diverse group, and it's wrong to kind of be black and white about these things. And I mean, I say it now at great age, and in retirement, it sounds very obvious, and it also sounds like retreating into a classic liberal position, but it's a sort of thing that's become important to me over the years. And I just wanted to, acknowledge that when we're talking about this backstory.
Well, I think that one thing you do in the book is you make it very clear how all these LECRA writers, in fact, are intelligible as belonging to this sort of pro-independence, nationalist, anti-imperialist current that's so broad in Indonesia.
Yes.
So I don't think you don't create any polarisation in that sense. But what about in the present then, Keith? With what do you think? Is there anything that will survive, do you think?
Look, this is tricky because as soon as you start talking about canon, you're into questions of literary value and all that. And that's the sort of thing that I have come to feel over time is not my place to enter into. Partly I think it's because I've come to feel, and again, it's something that sounds as though it's obvious, that questions of literary value are intimately and inevitably tied to language and language use. And I don't think that someone like me who speaks and reads Indonesian as a second language with all the limitations that implies, I don't think I've got any basis for entering into things like questions of value and canon formation and so. That's something for Indonesians to work on, and I think they will decide that. I'm more interested in, listening to what Indonesians whose opinions and approaches I respect have to say about those sorts of things, because I think rather than talk about whether things belong in the canon or not, and I'm not saying that I don't have my own ideas about it. I do. And I would say in direct reply to your questions that there are very important LECRA works that should be in that canon. But that's not something that I would enter into in an academic context because of my position. And I think that comes to the last thing I'd say, which is that I've come to believe very strongly that the contribution that we outsiders make should be in the area of literary history, of looking on from the outside and using our resources to document and analyse the literary record. And that means, of course, adopting the view, regardless of the canon, that everything Indonesian writers have left us, both in terms of creative writing and thinking about literature and the arts, is valuable because it's a part of Indonesian cultural history, and it's our role to document and analyse that.
I think that gives us a great segue into Kelana, because what your literary history, Keith, is being disseminated more widely now, because for the first time it's being published in Indonesian. And Kelana, can I ask you, please? So why now? Why is social commitment in literature and arts being translated and published now, Kelana? Is there a big interest in it amongst Indonesian readers?
Maybe I will start the answer to this question about why we publish this book. That was translated by Rima Febriani back to my early college. Is it okay?
Yeah.
Then when did I realize that references about the LECRA history were hard to find, especially in my college library, except some references, of course, about these organizations, which was written by former LECRA opponents in the guided democracy period, when the LECRA members was when LECRA was the prominent cultural organizations at the time. while I was starting to seek the other alternatives reference to it, then I found some books that Whykeith Fulcher's works, and question arose, why was this book really hard to find and have not published yet? The answer to this simple question is complicated, and one among others, as Keith Fulcher has mentioned on these books, that this book was written in the New Order, orthodoxy circumstance, political circumstances, and the anti-communist propaganda. That then I met Rima Fabriani at Burima, at the community that we had initiated, named Komunitas Solo, and historiography studies community, and at that time I was made a publisher, and she was asking our backlist that we will be published, and one of the titles that I mentioned is social commitment in literature and the arts. Then she asked me to become the translator of this book, and since then we've been working on this translation, and we had planned to publish it in 2018 with Putu Okasuka, along with Putu Okasukanta 18th anniversary, but because of some reasons, that the schedule was postponed. And the honest answer is this book is significant as an alternative discourse about Lekra. As we know, some former Lekra opponents, such D.S. Mulyanto, Aji Prosidi, and so on, and other writers that link to Horizon magazine that lately has linked to Congress for Cultural Freedom, an organization that backed by Central Intelligence Agency of United States of America, wrote some books or articles about them, and the other things is this book was written by a scholar, which is Keith Fulcher itself, is not tied to this organization or engaged to the cultural polemic when the lectures exist, and against the big dubs. I think the book sets up the history and the critics of Lekra in a proportional account. And the important things for my generations that was born almost 40 years late after Lekra Benis by New Order. I was born in 1996. I'm sorry. My generation needs to recognize the story about organizations that ever existed in our nation history. The organization which engaged in what Ben Anderson called imagining how the culture of these multicultural communities that imagine it as Indonesia found their cultural form. But the discourse about Lekra, especially in academic communities in my college life, remain as black and white narration. And the vast majority of my generation, I suppose, that didn't know of our dark history in the past are curious why the people who were not combatants, they were artists, writers, dancers, and so on, were killed, tortured, imprisoned without charge or trial. And the consequences of this, we are blurred to see our diverse and rich culture, and the legacy of this.
Can I ask Kalana then about your generation and about the reception of the book? How has it been received? I mean, has there been a warm reception, or has there been any criticisms, or can you tell us a bit about the reception of the translation?
Yes. Honestly, I was surprised by the positive response of this book, frankly. regardless from the readers of the English version of this book in the past, when they know that this book's finally published in Indonesian version, the exciting thing is that many people, especially the younger generation of my generation, I think, asked what is Lekra and what happened to them in the past. It's nice. It's a nice question, but it makes me happy because the question that I explained, mentioned, explained a clear fact for us, Pustakapias, that this book is maybe useful to raising awareness about our cultural history, and the most important thing, however, it is not a focus of although it's not the focus of this book, it is also raising awareness about crimes against humanity to Lekra. But the interesting questions raised in the previous discussion is with the Bandung Readers Festival is how about the gender composition in the of this generation of Lekra? What was Lekra voiced artists or writers' problems such property of artists and so on? And so it was, the first question is quite hard to answer because so far the research about this organization was focused on national or the headquarters of Lekra in Jakarta. But as I viewed in some photos in Harian Rakyat newspapers, there were good gender composition, though it was not ideal if we were comparing to this day, of course. And those response made us believe that there might be opportunities in the future for new works about Lekra.
Okay. Well, look, Kalana, thank you so much. And I hope you stay with us, because I'm going to ask Sharon to mediate any questions that we might have.
Yes, great. Thank you all. And I can see some questions here already. So let me just flick back up and do write them into your comments. So Harry's asked here, does the book have any old photographs in it?
Who wants to talk about this?
Yeah, you go, Keith.
Yeah. Photographs, eh? Yeah, this is, it shouldn't be, but it's another interesting and long story. And I'll give you the short version of it. But the original book did come with a photo insert, you know, photos of Lekra figures, photographs of a series of Lekra woodcuts, book covers, stuff like that I'd put together. When it went to Indonesia, yes, the photos of Lekra figures, many of them had been taken by a friend of mine in Indonesia, and thinking I was doing the right thing, I put under the caption, in the captions, you know, saying who the photo was of, a note saying who had taken the photo. Now, when those copies were received, first copies were received in Indonesia, it caused a bit of a panic. I had a phone call, not from the friend who'd taken the photos, but from a friend of his who spoke to me on the telephone. You know, this was a big thing in the 1980s, spoke to me on the phone in German, because she didn't want to use Indonesian or English on the phone, telling me that my friend was shocked to see his name credited as the photographer there, because it was something that could get him into great trouble. I was a bit naive, of course. It didn't occur to me to think that it was evidence for any security officials looking on to say that this friend of mine had contacts with, you know, leftist foreign academics, which was quite taboo at the time. So all the original copies were withdrawn and the photo inserts were taken out. Now, if I can just kind of speak something that Kalana told me, for the translation, he asked me if I had photos which could be included in it. I sent the original photos, you know, in a different climate, and they were not included again. But this is very interesting. They were. Kalana told me, if I can speak for him, it told me that they were not included because they were gender imbalanced. They were all photos of men. And that's really interesting, isn't it? Because we're sensitive to that issue today, whereas back in the 1980s, it was all the political and ideological questions. So on both counts, the photos were not included. There are some illustrations in the translation of Lekra artworks, which is good to see. But that's the story of the photos of people and why they're not there.
Great, thank you. Lenny, do you want to ask the next question? We can take it in turns.
Yeah, sure. So the next question is from, because there's a few here now, from Mirza, I think. Yes. What happened to actually in the polemic between Manifest Politics, Lekra, and Manifestasi Kebudayaan by H.B. Yassin? Did you get that, Keith?
No, sorry. What is the question?
I'm also trying to figure out. So what happened actually in the polemic between Manifest Politics Lekra and Manifestasi Kebudayaan?
Yeah. It's really a very big question, of course, that we don't have time to talk about here. But it was a bitter polemic over really to what extent political commitment was an appropriate part of an artist's expression. You know, that was the sense, that was the gist of the polemic, that Lekra was seen as politicizing the arts, and that's what the Manifest Kebudayaan was also politics in art, but it presented itself as apolitical. You know, it's very hard to talk about, and we certainly can't talk about it in 5 minutes, but it's a good topic.
Right.
Kalana, do you want to say something?
No.
Kalani, you can start with the next question from Yacinta Makasi. What kind of response are you expecting, or did you get from people inside Indonesia with the publication of the book in Indonesian?
We hope that there will be another works that will be written by Indonesian scholars in the future about Lekra, of course, because there were many interesting topics such as how these organizations in the Cold War about this organization in the Cold War context, especially in the global South discourse, such as there was Afro-Asian writers' conference in the camps and so on that Kate has mentioned in this book. But there was no anyone who were writing about it. I think we want another the readers who read this book make another interesting equation and write about it.
The next question is also probably good for Kalana. The question is from Jenny Lindsay. Who was the translator, and were there any special challenges in the process of translating the book? Mas Kalana?
Yeah, the translator is Wima Febrani. She was a lecturer in the Universitas Pajajaran, English lecturer in Universitas Pajajaran. And the difficult special challenge on these books were about the statistic, about how the sentences that cat watchers write, and in the 1989 is when it was translated in Indonesia today. We need to contextualize to how the recent works are written and are readable for our readers. and some archives that really hard to find, such as I asked to Pak King vouchers about its zaman baru, and we could not find in the perpustakaan Arsip Nasional Perpustakaan Indonesia, and Pak King voucher was asked me to erase that paraphrase quote that quote and paraphrase it in a one sentence. That is.
Mas Kelana, you should have asked me. I'm a librarian. I can probably help you with that.
Hey, I'm sure he'll take you up on that. Next question, a good one from Andy Fuller. A question for both Kelana and Keith. Great work on the publication. What are the works from LECRA affiliated authors that still need to be translated into English?
Stephen Miller.
Are we talking about works by LECRA authors back in the 1950s and 60s? Look, I think there are some important works in the recent period, but you know, it really goes back to my sense about the importance of documenting Indonesian literary history. I'm not sure that there are particular works by LECRA authors at that time that, taken out of their context, are appropriate for translation out of context for an international readership. It sounds as though I'm putting them down, but it seems to me that you know, they are such specific expressions of a chapter in Indonesian cultural history that, taking them out of that context, translating them into an alien context, I just don't, you know, I don't really see the point. Their whole point was not to write for an international audience, you know? So it's a very specific audience that they're writing for. And it seems, yeah, I don't know whether I'm speaking heretically, but it seems to me that they are written for an Indonesian, for a readership that reads Indonesian and is Indonesia literate. And just from my own point of view, I wouldn't take them out of that. Which is not to say that there aren't works by former LECRA writers in the more recent period that really do need translating, you know, because they belong to a different world and a different context.
The next question, there's a few more questions here. Would there be a chance to engage schools in Indonesia in reading this literature? Probably maybe question for Kelana.
I think it's really hard to engage to the readers of this book in Indonesian school, because the legacy of anti-communist propaganda that were working there, the baru communist propaganda, the order of communist propaganda. And honestly, when we were working on these projects, and we were assuming how these works were in the future will be received for the people, and we were feared that maybe there is some special question that will be addressed to us, but that's just our fear. But it's really, I think it's really hard to engage this readerships of this book in the school.
Thank you. And I'm apologizing in advance. We're not going to get through all the questions, which is, you know, great on one hand, but apologies in advance. But we will take as many as we can up until the o'clock. So next one's from Charles for Keith. So from today's perspective, it is understandably and justifiably common to see LECRA members as victims. But do you think there is also a case to see their opponents, such as Mane Kabul, participants in the 1963-65 period, as victims?
The simple answer to that is yes, indeed. Victimization, I mean, I suppose it's going back to what I tried to slip in about my reaction to Gunawan Muhammad's paper. You know, we have to recognize that there were victims on both sides. I mean, you know, the problem is that you start to then weigh up qualities of victimhood. Was the things that people on the you know, the anti-LECRA side, the things that they were victimized about and that they suffered in the 1960s, such as people being dismissed from their university jobs under student-led protests because they were reactionary or this kind of thing, does that stack up against losing 10 years or more of your life to inhumane conditions in prison? And so, you know, you get caught up in an argument about degrees of suffering and everything, which again, I think is really not productive. We have to move on from those things.
Is from Boo Margaret. For Keith, do you also have a comment to make on LECRA's musical imprints through LECRA-associated composers, soloists, choirs, and orchestras made prominent through RRI, Radio Republik Indonesia, organized categories of revolutionary nationalists, including lagu seriosa and keroncong song? Yeah. Sharifa Faisal is publishing her Monash PhD research on LECRA's impact and experiences since 1965.
This is really interesting because the simple answer is that I know very little about this, but what it does is remind us that since I wrote this very sketchy monograph back in the mid-1980s, in recent times, young people are doing really great work to recover that archive and to write more about it. Certainly, people like, there are people who know about these things much more than I do. And it's all to do with recent research that has now become possible. LECRA LECRA musicians played an incredibly important role in the definition of Indonesian music in all its forms in the immediate post-independence period. Like the history of Indonesian plastic arts, literature kind of fades into the background when you look at the really prominent role that LECRA artists played in other areas of the arts, such as music and painting. They were really, really important. And when I did my work about LECRA, all I knew was just the references that cropped up in the cultural pages of the PKI newspapers and so on. I didn't have any first-hand information about that at all. So my knowledge is all very sketchy, and I'm delighted that there are people who now are working on those sorts of things and recovering that lost history.
Thank you very much, Keith and Kelana, and also Julian, and a big shout out as always to Lauren, Amy, Anita and Rennie for all their help in making this possible. So please join us again next year when we'll be back with our seminar series again. Margaret Katomi, who asked the last question there, will be leading us off, and we have also Dedi Otomo, we have Henry Julius, we have Saskia Viringha. So an action-packed calendar planned for next year. So until then, semoga sehat and sampai jumpa and terima kasih.